Today I want to talk about the author of some of the most exciting, strange, and compelling writing I have ever read, Clarice Lispector. I have read 4 books by this Ukrainian-born Brazilian author, 3 of them very recently, and I have to say, I just cannot wait to read more from her. Lispector is one of the very few writers I would like to read everything they wrote. If you like good books, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Not only will you be making my day, but you'll also be helping other people find my videos. Reading Lispector's writing is a sensorial experience, even from me, who, if pressed, would probably say that reading is purely intellectual. It's a purely intellectual pursuit. I've only very rarely cried while reading fiction, or even felt shocked. Well, Clarice Lispector's writing does things to me that no writing does. I hate it when people talk about reading fiction as an escapist activity because I never feel like I escape from anything while reading. The kind of writing I read tends to connect me to other people and other ideas about what it means to be alive. Yes, on a very superficial level, reading fiction could be time off from one's real life, even from one's problems, but I don't think reading fiction, or at least not the fiction I read, allows to escape life. And if a writer has ever forced me to confront the pain and the joy of being alive, that is Clarice Lispector. She was a journalist and a fiction writer. As a fiction writer, she wrote short stories, novellas, novels. Let me tell you about the 4 books by her that I've read so far. Oh, but before I do that, let me remind you that although Lispector wrote all her books in Portuguese, all the books I'm going to discuss are widely available in English, and you will find links to them in the description box for this video in case you would like to read them and experience mind-blowing writing for yourself. Last year, I read Family Ties, or Laços de Família. This is a short story collection published in 1960. I must confess that I prefer longer fiction in general. I often tend to derive less pleasure from reading short stories than I do from reading longer fiction, even novellas. I don't know why that is, but I suspect it has something to do with who I am as a reader. I like to get lost in a book for hours and hours, over days, sometimes weeks, sometimes even months. And while you can do that, you can certainly do that with a short story collection, you are reading different texts. So it's almost like short stories are not quite long enough for me to get lost in them. I mean, how long does it take to read a short story? An hour? Sometimes a lot less than that. Reading a collection of short stories is often like this. I read a short story, and when I'm beginning to enjoy it, it ends, and I am forced to move on and read something that is often written in a completely different style. But of course, that is not the case with all short story collections. Reading the best short story collections actually feels more like listening to a good music album, where even the order of every song, or in this case story, has been carefully designed so that every piece contributes to a whole. And that is why I prefer short story books like Family Ties, where the author herself decided which stories to include and the order in which they would be presented, to other books with titles such as The Best Stories By or The Collected Stories Of. So, okay, there are 13 stories in Family Ties. In order, they are Daydreams of a Drunk Woman, and isn't that a great title? I love it. Love, The Chicken, The Imitation of the Rose, Happy Birthday, The Smallest Woman in the World, The Dinner, Preciousness, Family Ties, which gives the title to the book, The Beginnings of a Fortune, Mystery in São Cristóvão, The Crime of the Math Professor, and The Buffalo. All the books I've read by Lispector belong to her later career after she had returned to Rio de Janeiro after living in Western Europe. I would love to read some of her earlier work next, particularly her first published novel, Near to the Wild Heart, or Perto do Coração Selvagem, which was published in 1943 when Lispector had just turned 23. Chaya Pichanov's Lispector was born in Shtetl in the Russian Empire in 1920, in a region that today belongs to the Ukraine. She was the youngest of three sisters, and because of the pogroms during the Russian Civil War, her whole family fled the country and moved further west until eventually they went to Brazil, where they arrived in 1922. So little Chaya Lispector was not even 2 when they arrived in Brazil. They changed her name from Chaya to Clarice upon their arrival. Her whole family adopted Portuguese names upon arrival. Okay, so the family, the Lispectors, lived in different cities in the Brazilian northeast. Clarice's mother, Marieta, who was born Mania, died in 1930 when Clarice was only 9 years old. 5 years later, her father decided that the whole family would move south to Rio de Janeiro in search of a better life, and he was also thinking of the prospect of finding good Jewish husbands for his 3 daughters. And talking about husbands, let's talk about Clarice's married life. She married a Brazilian diplomat, Mauri Gurgel Valente, in early 1943, only a few days after she had become a Brazilian citizen. She was 22 years old then. Later that year, she wrote her first novel, Near to the Wild Heart, to great critical acclaim. In 1944, Clarice and her husband quit Brazil for Italy. For Clarice, this was her first time overseas since coming to Brazil as a toddler. Over the next couple of decades, the couple lived in different parts of Western Europe and the United States until in 1960, Clarice divorced her husband and moved back to Rio permanently with her son. And it is in this context that Family Ties was first published in Brazil. In the intervening years, Clarice wrote several books, which are all available in English translation. I am going to write a list of all her books in chronological order in the show notes down below. So if you're interested in reading any of them, click on the links so you can buy them from the Book Depository. Why? Okay, there are a few reasons for this. Number one, the Book Depository offers free delivery worldwide. So no matter where you are, they send the books for free. And if you buy books using my links, not just Lispector's, any books, you will be supporting my channel without having to pay anything extra. Going back to Family Ties, most of the stories in this book explore daily life in unexpected and strange ways. It is important to say that the characters in Family Ties, as in most of Clarice's writing, are white middle or upper middle class. I don't say that as a criticism at all. I just want you to adjust your expectations because I feel, and I could be wrong, I could be very prejudiced here, I don't know, but I feel like readers from the global north, you know, the States, Canada, Europe, etc., sometimes expect writing from the global south to reflect on the misery, poverty, and crime that they imagine most people live in countries like Brazil. So, if you pick up Family Ties expecting that, you will be sorely disappointed. The most recent book by Lispectors I've read is The Passion According to G.H., which was published in 1964. If you have ever wondered what would make a woman eat a dying cockroach, you need to read this novel. And if you find the thought of that utterly disgusting, and trust me, I did and I still do, you need to get over yourself and read The Passion According to G.H. anyway. This novel is not just one of the best novels of Brazilian literature. It is not even one of the best novels to come out of Latin America. Nah. The Passion According to G.H. is simply one of the best novels ever published. The action takes place in just a few hours. G.H. is a middle or upper middle class woman who lives in Rio de Janeiro, and she wonders about her own identity. Being left alone in her apartment, she decides to clean up the room that used to belong to her maid. So her maid quit the day before the novel takes place. So it is there in the maid's room that most of the novel takes place. Although I think it might be more accurate to say that the maid's room is where G.H. spends the narrative time. The novel actually takes place in G.H.'s mind. The narration is an internal monologue. G.H. begins to experience an identity crisis when she's confronted with a cockroach. She tries to kill the roach, but it is staring at the dying and possibly agonizing insect that G.H.'s personality begins to break down. There is a clear connection here between Lispector's The Passion According to G.H. and Kafka's The Metamorphosis, but Lispector's novel is unique. Something that fascinates me is how she connects all the chapters by picking the last sentence of every chapter and reproducing it as the first sentence of the next chapter. Now, this technique gives continuity to the narrative, but it also makes the ending of the novel definite. There is a clear sense that this novel, The Passion According to G.H., could not go on. This is the kind of book that only improves when reread, because I think it can be read differently depending on your mood and what is going on in your life. And, thinking about it, that might also be true of Lispector's writing in general. For example, I think I'll reread her Agua Viva, which is sometimes translated as The Stream of Life, as soon as I can. Agua Viva is also an interior monologue, but it is harder to classify than The Passion According to G.H. or Family Ties. Agua Viva is a hybrid of many literary genres, yet I didn't find it difficult to read. The writing flows in such a way that I find it as compelling as a book can be. If anything, the problem I think I had with Agua Viva is that I read it too quickly, and partly that is the reason I'd like to read it again soon, but mostly I want to pick it up again because of the sheer joy I felt as I made my way through it. It is interesting that I feel like I read it too quickly and that I need to spend more time in this text, because Agua Viva grapples with the fleeting moments that make up our life. Although human language is inadequate to convey this, Lispector tries, and I think she gets as close to it as it is possible. Agua Viva is not a linear narrative. In fact, there is little narrative in it. There is only language and time. And the language is deployed by a woman. That much is clear. Although at this point, that is something that I have come to expect from Lispector's writing. And that is why I was surprised by her novella, The Hour of the Star, which is told from a male point of view, and it's the most recent book by her that I've read. The Hour of the Star came out posthumously in 1977, which is also the year of Lispector's death. It is often hailed as her most accessible work. I tend to agree with that, but so far I haven't found any of her writing particularly inaccessible. This is something I'd like to talk about a bit more because Clarice Lispector is often thought of as a difficult writer. Her books are often framed as difficult, but so far I haven't encountered any writing by her that I would describe as difficult or inaccessible. And conventional? Original? Yes, absolutely, but also hugely enjoyable. I think what makes people say that The Hour of the Star is more accessible than her other books is that it has a plot. That's it. I don't think that necessarily makes it easier to read than Agua Viva or The Passion According to G.H., but I guess it will be a less strange experience to readers used to plot. The male narrator is a male writer. The male narrator is a writer, Rodrigo Essiemi, who begins by telling us about a novel he is writing, which is also the novel we are reading. So you can see that The Hour of the Star is a postmodern novel. Because I haven't read anything Lispector wrote between Agua Viva and The Hour of the Star, I can't really say if her last novel was a departure for her. With my yet limited knowledge of Clarice Lispector's work, I would say that it is unmistakably a piece of work by the author of Family Ties and all the other books I've read. And yet, it is different in some key ways. The introspection, the philosophical questions, all of that are there in The Hour of the Star as with her previous books. But there is also an assuredness and an ostensive simplicity that I don't perceive in her earlier work writing, at least among the ones I've read. The novel that Rodrigo Essiemi is writing is about a humble girl from the Northeast, which is the poorest region of Brazil. So this is also a return to Clarice's origins because she grew up in the Northeast after her family fled Europe. But The Hour of the Star is also a reflection on writing fiction and the role of the author. The book even questions the authority the author has in telling a story that doesn't belong to him. In this case, the story of Macabea, an extremely poor young woman searching her own identity in contemporary Rio. Now, to my knowledge, Clarice Lispector only gave one TV interview in her life, which was in 1977, which is also the year she died. Luckily, that interview is available on YouTube with English subtitles, so if you are interested, I link to it in the description. I've watched it several times and I watched it again in preparation for this video. One of the revelations she makes in that interview is that she never considered herself a professional writer. She thought that a professional writer is a writer who makes a commitment to herself and to other people, to her readers. And the commitment is to write and continue writing. She thought of herself as an amateur writer because that was her way of keeping her freedom. Now, for someone who started writing as a young child, continued until her death, largely earned her living from writing as far as I know, and navigated different genres from chronicles, short stories, novellas, novels, children's literature, and others, that is a bold claim to make. Perhaps the most interesting thing about Lispector's TV interview is when she talks about The Hour of the Star, what that novella is about according to her and what inspired her to write it. But I think the whole interview is a must-watch for anyone interested in her writing. Reading Clarice's writing is always a visceral experience, at least for me. In her TV interview, she says that she doesn't know what kind of reader reads her books. I don't think I know that either. I do think that Clarice is for everyone. But you need to approach her writing with an open mind and not try too hard to understand what she's trying to tell you. She thought of her writing as simple and not dressed up, and you know, I must agree with that. So have you read any of her books? Let me know in the comment section down below so we can talk more about Clarice Lispector and her books.